Imagine your daughter kissing you goodbye before her night shift, and that being the last time you ever see her face. In 1976, 24-year-old Brandy clocked out of Miller's Diner and vanished into the cold November darkness. Her family searched for answers that never came. But in 2001, a truck driver made a discovery at a rest stop that would break hearts all over again. What he found changed everything. Yet somehow, it explained nothing at all. Brandy wasn't just another waitress. She was somebody's everything. Her mother, Dorothy, would later tell police that Brandy called her every single night after work, every single night, without fail. That phone call never came on November 12, 1976. Dorothy waited by that avocado green rotary phone until sunrise, her coffee going cold, her hands shaking. When the sun came up and the phone stayed silent, she knew something terrible had happened. Mothers always know. They feel it in their bones, in their chest, in that place where love and fear live together. Dorothy grabbed her coat and drove straight to Miller's Diner. The parking lot was empty except for one car, Brandy's powder blue Chevy Nova, still sitting there under the flickering streetlight. The driver's side door was unlocked. Brandy's purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet inside with $12, still tucked in the billfold. Her keys dangled from the ignition. The engine was cold. Everything looked normal, like she'd just run inside for a moment and would be right back. But Brandy wasn't coming back. Dorothy's legs nearly gave out when she saw that purse. Brandy never went anywhere without it. She kept everything in there, her lipstick, her photographs, her tips from the night before. Dorothy touched the vinyl seat, still feeling for warmth that wasn't there anymore. She ran inside the diner, her voice cracking as she called Brandy's name. The morning cook found her wandering between empty booths, calling for a daughter who wasn't there. Police arrived within the hour. Officer Gene Hartley took Dorothy's statement while his partner searched the vehicle. Nothing seemed disturbed, no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no blood. It looked like Brandy had simply parked her car and evaporated into thin air. But people don't just vanish. Something always happens. Someone always knows something. Officer Hartley asked Dorothy the hard questions that morning. Did Brandy have problems at home? Was there a boyfriend? Any enemies? Dorothy shook her head to every question, her tissues crumpling in her fist. Brandy was saving money for nursing school. She'd just gotten promoted to the evening shift because the tips were better. She was happy. She was planning her future. And now that future had been stolen in the space between a car door closing and dawn breaking. The investigation started fast but hit walls everywhere. Police interviewed everyone who worked at Miller's Diner that night. The cook, Harold, said Brandy left around 11:30, same as always. She'd seemed fine. Tired, maybe, but fine. She'd counted her tips, stuffed them in her apron pocket, and waved goodbye. Another waitress, Linda, remembered Brandy mentioning she needed gas but was too tired to stop. She planned to fill up in the morning. That detail would haunt investigators for years. If Brandy made it to her car, turned the key, and then what? Why didn't she drive away? What made her get back out? Or did someone stop her before she could even start the engine? The questions multiplied like shadows, and nobody had answers. Days turned into weeks. Dorothy plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole in 3 counties. Brandy's face smiled from storefront windows and gas station bulletin boards. The local newspaper ran her story on the front page. Tips poured in, but they all led nowhere. Someone thought they saw Brandy at a bus station in Ohio. Another caller swore they'd spotted her at a shopping mall 2 states over. Police chased every lead, but Brandy remained gone. Her father, Robert, drove the highways every weekend, searching rest stops and diners, showing her photograph to truckers and waitresses, asking if anyone had seen his little girl. He wore the same jacket every time, the one Brandy had bought him for his birthday. He couldn't let her go. None of them could. How do you bury someone when there's no body? How do you mourn when hope refuses to die? By Christmas of 1976, the case had grown cold. Police had no suspects, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Brandy's car had been processed and released back to the family. Dorothy couldn't bring herself to sell it. She parked it in the garage and covered it with a tarp, like maybe one day Brandy would come home and need it again. The holidays were unbearable. Brandy's stocking hung on the mantel. Her present sat wrapped under the tree. Dorothy set a place for her at Christmas dinner, an empty chair that screamed louder than any words. Neighbors whispered. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. These stories deserve to be heard everywhere. Some thought Dorothy had lost her mind, but those of us who've loved someone know the truth. Grief doesn't follow rules. It doesn't make sense. It just exists, heavy and constant, like breathing underwater. Years passed. The 70s became the 80s. Brandy's case file gathered dust in a storage room at the police station. Dorothy never stopped searching. She joined support groups for families of missing persons. She wrote letters to television shows that featured unsolved cases. She called the police department every few months, asking if there were any updates. There never were. Officer Hartley, who'd taken that first report, retired in 1989. Before he left, he stopped by Dorothy's house one afternoon. He told her he'd never forgotten about Brandy. He said he was sorry he couldn't bring her home. Dorothy thanked him and gave him a hug that lasted too long. They both knew what it meant. They were saying goodbye to hope. But Dorothy couldn't quit. Not yet. Not ever. In the spring of 1995, Robert passed away from a heart attack. The doctors called it cardiac arrest, but Dorothy knew better. He'd died of a broken heart. He'd spent 19 years searching for their daughter, and the not knowing had killed him slowly from the inside. At his funeral, Dorothy placed a photograph of Brandy in his casket. Father and daughter, together again in the only way left. Dorothy stood at the grave long after everyone else had gone home. She talked to both of them, her husband and her daughter, asking why life had been so cruel, asking why she'd been left behind, asking when the pain would finally stop. The wind moved through the cemetery trees, and Dorothy swore she heard Brandy's voice telling her to keep going. So she did, because that's what mothers do. They carry the weight until their very last breath. Dorothy was 73 years old when her phone rang on a March afternoon in 2001. 25 years had passed since that November night. The voice on the other end identified himself as Detective Mike Torres from the state police. Dorothy's heart stopped. She'd gotten calls like this before. False alarms, mistaken identities, cruel hoaxes. But something in this detective's voice sounded different. He asked if she could come down to the station. He said they'd found something. Dorothy's hands shook so badly she could barely hang up the phone. Her neighbor drove her to the police station because Dorothy couldn't see through her tears. All those years of waiting, all those years of wondering, maybe now she'd finally know what happened to her baby girl. Maybe now she could finally say goodbye. Detective Torres met Dorothy in a small room with gray walls and fluorescent lights that buzzed too loud. He sat across from her, a manila folder in his hands. He explained that 3 days earlier, a truck driver named Earl Peterson had stopped at a rest area off Interstate 40. Earl was doing his walk-around inspection, checking his tires and fuel lines. That's when he noticed something wedged between two concrete parking barriers. At first, he thought it was trash. But when he bent down to look closer, he saw it was a locket, silver, tarnished, covered in years of dirt and oil. Earl almost left it there, but something made him pick it up. Maybe curiosity, maybe fate. He pried the locket open with his thumbnail, and inside was a photograph. A young woman's face, faded and water-stained, but still visible. A waitress in a light blue uniform. Earl took the locket to the police station in the nearest town. The officer on duty didn't recognize the face, but something about it felt familiar. They searched through old missing person files, and that's when they found her. Brandy. The photograph in the locket matched the one from her missing person report. The locket had been out there for years, decades maybe, waiting to be found. Detective Torres opened the folder and slid the evidence bag across the table. Dorothy's hands trembled as she reached for it. Through the clear plastic, she could see the tarnished silver. She could see her daughter's face. Dorothy had given Brandy that locket for her 16th birthday. Brandy wore it every single day. She'd called it her good luck charm. Dorothy pressed the bag against her chest and sobbed until she had nothing left. Her daughter had been at that truck stop. Brandy had been there. But here's what made everything worse. That truck stop where Earl found the locket, it didn't exist in 1976. The rest area had been built in 1983, 7 years after Brandy disappeared, which meant one of two terrible things. Either someone kept that locket for 7 years and then dropped it there later, or Brandy's body had been moved, transported, hidden somewhere else first, and then relocated after the rest area was built. The thought made Dorothy physically ill. The idea that her daughter's remains had been disturbed, moved around like garbage, like she didn't matter. Detective Torres assured Dorothy they were treating this as an active homicide investigation now. They brought in cadaver dogs. They searched every inch of that rest area and the woods surrounding it. They dug up sections of pavement. They drained a nearby retention pond. And they found absolutely nothing. No remains, no clothing, no evidence. Just that locket, sitting there like a ghost. The case made national news in 2001. Television crews descended on the small town where Brandy had lived. Reporters interviewed Dorothy, who looked so much older than 73, aged by grief and questions that had no answers. She begged whoever knew something to come forward. She said she just wanted to bring Brandy home. She said she was running out of time and needed to lay her daughter to rest before she died. The story aired on several true crime shows. Tips flooded in again. A psychic called claiming Brandy's spirit had contacted her. A woman in Arizona said she'd seen someone who looked like Brandy at a grocery store. A man confessed to the murder, but recanted the next day, admitting he just wanted attention. None of it was real. None of it helped. Dorothy went back home and waited, just like she'd been waiting for 25 years. Detective Torres worked the case harder than anything in his career. He re-interviewed everyone from the original investigation who was still alive. Harold, the cook, had passed away in 1994. Linda, the other waitress, didn't remember much anymore. Her memory had faded with time. Officer Hartley, now retired and in his 70s, came back to help however he could. He walked Torres through everything he remembered from that first day. The unlocked car, the purse on the seat, the keys in the ignition. Torres asked if anything had seemed off at the time. Hartley thought for a long moment and then said something that changed the direction of everything. He said there'd been a man sitting in the diner parking lot that morning. A man in a truck who'd driven away when police arrived. Hartley hadn't thought much of it at the time. But now, looking back, he wondered. They tried to track down that truck driver, but it was impossible. No one had written down the license plate. No one remembered what he looked like. It had been 25 years. People's faces blur together. Details disappear. Torres hit dead end after dead end. He looked into other missing person cases from the same time period, searching for patterns. 3 other young women had vanished from truck stops and diners along Interstate 40 between 1974 and 1978. All of them worked night shifts. All of them disappeared without a trace. None of them had ever been found. Torres suspected they were connected. He believed a serial predator had been working that stretch of highway, picking off vulnerable women who worked alone late at night. Women like Brandy. But suspecting something and proving it are two completely different things. Without evidence, without bodies, there was nothing he could do. The forensics team examined the locket under every possible method. They tested it for DNA, but 25 years of exposure to weather and vehicle fluids had destroyed any biological material. They checked for fingerprints, but found nothing usable. They analyzed the dirt and oil, hoping to match it to a specific location, but the results were inconclusive. The locket had been handled by too many people, contaminated by too many elements. It was simultaneously the biggest break in the case and completely useless. Torres kept it on his desk anyway, in that evidence bag, looking at Brandy's faded photograph. He made a promise to her picture. He swore he wouldn't stop until he found out what happened. He wouldn't let her be forgotten. But as weeks turned into months, he realized he might not be able to keep that promise. Some cases never get solved. Some families never get closure. That's the terrible truth about missing persons. Dorothy stopped doing interviews after a while. The media attention died down. People moved on to the next tragedy, the next mystery. But Dorothy couldn't move on. How could she? Every time the phone rang, she thought it might be news. Every time there was a knock at the door, she wondered if they'd finally found Brandy. She kept the house exactly as it had been in 1976. Brandy's bedroom remained untouched. Her clothes still hung in the closet. Her hairbrush still sat on the dresser. Dorothy would go in there sometimes and just sit on the bed, holding Brandy's favorite sweater, breathing in a scent that had long since faded. She talked to Brandy like she was still there. She told her about the garden, about the neighbors, about how much she missed her, about how sorry she was that she couldn't protect her. In 2004, Dorothy's health started failing. She'd developed heart problems, the same ones that had taken Robert. The doctors said it was stress and age, but Dorothy knew better. It was grief. 3 decades of carrying unbearable weight. 3 decades of questions without answers. Her friends from church took turns checking on her, bringing meals, helping with groceries. They urged her to move into an assisted living facility, but Dorothy refused. She couldn't leave this house. This was where Brandy would come home to. If she left, how would Brandy find her? The logic didn't make sense to anyone else, but it made perfect sense to Dorothy. Hope doesn't die just because time passes. It doesn't fade just because everyone else stops believing. Hope is the cruelest thing we carry. It keeps us going, and it destroys us. Detective Torres visited Dorothy every few months. He never had good news. He just wanted her to know someone still cared, someone was still trying. On one visit, Dorothy asked him a question that broke his heart. She asked if he thought Brandy had suffered, if whoever took her had hurt her badly, if she'd been scared. Torres didn't know how to answer that. He couldn't lie, but he couldn't tell her the truth either. The truth was that most abduction cases end violently. The truth was that Brandy had probably died that same night in 1976. The truth was brutal and unforgiving. So Torres took Dorothy's hand and said the only thing he could. He said that wherever Brandy was now, she wasn't hurting anymore. She was at peace. And she knew her mother never stopped loving her, never stopped searching, never gave up. Dorothy passed away in her sleep on a cold January morning in 2006. She was 78 years old. The neighbor found her when she didn't answer the door. Dorothy was in Brandy's bedroom, lying on Brandy's bed, holding that photograph of them together at the state fair. The one where Brandy was 10 years old, grinning with cotton candy stuck to her face. Dorothy had a slight smile on her face when they found her. The coroner said she'd gone peacefully. Her heart had just stopped. But those of us who knew her understood what really happened. Dorothy had finally let go. After 30 years of holding on, of waiting, of hoping, she'd released herself from the weight. She'd gone to find Brandy wherever daughters and mothers go when this world is done with them. The funeral was small. Detective Torres attended. He stood at her grave and apologized for failing her. After Dorothy's death, the case file went back into storage. Torres retired in 2008. Before he left, he made copies of everything related to Brandy's case. He kept them in his home office, in boxes that his wife complained about but never made him throw away. Torres couldn't let it go. Even in retirement, he'd pull out those files and read through them, searching for something he'd missed, some detail that would crack everything open. He reached out to other retired detectives, to cold case units in neighboring states, to anyone who might help. Most of them told him the same thing. Without remains, without witnesses, without physical evidence beyond a locket found in a place that didn't exist when she vanished, There was nothing to investigate. The trail had gone cold decades ago. It was time to accept that some mysteries stay mysteries, but Torres couldn't accept it. He wouldn't. In 2012, Torres got a call from a woman named Patricia. She'd seen one of the old news stories about Brandy online and needed to tell someone what she knew. Patricia had worked at a truck stop about 40 miles from Miller's Diner back in 1976. She remembered a regular customer, a long-haul trucker named Vernon, who always came through on Thursday nights. Vernon had stopped showing up after November of 1976. She hadn't thought about it in years, but something about Brandy's story brought the memory back. Torres felt his pulse quicken. He asked Patricia if she remembered Vernon's last name or what company he drove for. She didn't. It had been 36 years. But she remembered his truck was dark blue with some kind of bird painted on the door. Torres spent weeks tracking down trucking companies that operated in 1976, but most had gone out of business or been bought out by larger corporations. Their records were gone. Torres managed to locate a few retired truckers who'd worked that route in the 70s. He showed them photographs of Brandy and asked if they remembered seeing her or hearing about her disappearance. Most didn't. One man, however, said something that made Torres's blood run cold. He said there'd been rumors back then about a driver who had a thing for waitresses, someone who'd take souvenirs, someone dangerous. But it was just trucker gossip, the kind of ghost stories drivers told each other on long, lonely roads. No one knew his name. No one knew if he was even real. It might have just been talk. But maybe, just maybe, it was the truth. Maybe Vernon was the man they'd been looking for all along. Maybe he'd taken Brandy that night. And maybe he'd kept her locket as a trophy before losing it years later. But Torres couldn't prove any of it. Not without more evidence. Torres reached out to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, which tracks serial offenders across state lines. He asked them to cross-reference Brandy's case with unsolved murders and disappearances of young women working night shifts along major trucking routes in the 1970s. The FBI found 11 cases that matched the pattern. 11 young women, all between ages 22 and 28. All worked late shifts at diners or gas stations, all vanished without a trace. None of them ever found. The timeline stretched from 1973 to 1979. Then the cases stopped. Either the killer died, got arrested for something else, or simply moved to a different hunting ground. Torres felt sick. 11 families had gone through what Dorothy went through. 11 mothers had waited by phones that never rang. 11 daughters who never came home. And the person responsible had likely gotten away with it. Was probably still out there somewhere, old now, but alive. Free. Torres tried to get the FBI to open a formal investigation, but they said there wasn't enough evidence to justify the resources. The cases were too old. The witnesses were dead or unreliable. The physical evidence was non-existent. It would be a waste of time and money to pursue it. Torres argued. He pleaded. He sent detailed reports showing the connections, the patterns, the timeline, but bureaucracy doesn't care about justice. It cares about statistics and budgets. The FBI declined to move forward. Torres sat in his home office that night surrounded by those boxes of files and cried for the first time since he'd been a boy. He cried for Brandy, for Dorothy, for those 11 other women and their families. He cried because he'd failed all of them. Because the system had failed them. Because monsters sometimes win and there's nothing we can do about it. In 2015, Torres was diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctors gave him 2 years at best. He spent that time doing everything he could to bring attention back to Brandy's case. He created a website dedicated to her story. He posted on true crime forums. He did podcast interviews. He wanted people to remember her name. To know that she'd existed, that she'd mattered, that she wasn't just another statistic in an unsolved case file. Torres passed away in March of 2017, surrounded by his family. His last words to his daughter were about Brandy. He made her promise to keep the website running, to never let Brandy be forgotten. His daughter kept that promise. The website is still up today. You can see Brandy's photograph there, smiling in her light blue Waitress uniform, frozen forever at 24 years old. Still missing, still waiting to be found. Brandy's case remains officially unsolved. The locket is still in an evidence locker at the state police headquarters, cataloged and stored, waiting for some future detective who might see something everyone else missed. Brandy's car is gone now, sold for scrap years ago. Dorothy and Robert's house was sold after Dorothy passed away. New families have lived there, completely unaware of the tragedy that soaked into those walls. Miller's Diner closed in 1998 and was demolished to make room for a chain restaurant. The parking lot where Brandy's car was found is now covered by a drive-through lane. All the physical places connected to her story have disappeared. But Brandy herself hasn't disappeared. Not completely. She exists in memory, in police files, in the hearts of people who've heard her story and refuse to forget. That's all any of us can hope for, really, to be remembered, to matter to someone, to not vanish completely. There are still people who search for answers. True crime enthusiasts who study the case online, amateur investigators who compare notes and theories. Some believe Brandy is buried somewhere along Interstate 40 in one of those stretches of lonely forest between rest stops. Others think her remains were disposed of in a way that makes recovery impossible. A few optimists hold on to hope that maybe somehow Brandy is still alive somewhere, living under a different name, suffering from amnesia, or trapped in circumstances she can't escape. That hope is probably misplaced. But who are we to take it away? Hope is sometimes all we have. It's the candle we light against the dark. It's the last thing we let go of. And for some people, letting go feels like giving up, feels like betrayal, feels like saying the person we loved never mattered in the first place. Brandy would be 73 years old today if she'd lived. She'd probably be a grandmother by now. Maybe she would have become that nurse she dreamed about. Maybe she would have traveled, fallen in love, experienced all the beautiful, ordinary moments that make up a life. But someone stole all of that from her. Someone decided that her dreams didn't matter, that her future was his to take. And that person has never been held accountable. They've never had to look Dorothy in the eye and explain why they destroyed her family. They've never had to feel the weight of what they did. That's the injustice that keeps this story alive. That's why we can't forget. Because somewhere out there, maybe someone knows something. Maybe someone saw something that November night in 1976. Maybe a father or grandfather made a confession on his deathbed that a family member has kept secret all of these years. Maybe the truth is still out there, waiting to surface. Or maybe it died with the person who took Brandy and we'll never know. Maybe that's the real nightmare. Not the violence itself, but the silence that follows. The questions that outlive us all. The daughters who never come home. Stories like this remind us why cold case files and unsolved mysteries continue to captivate us. This disappearance mystery represents thousands of missing person cases where families never get closure. True crime stories and crime documentaries help keep these vanished without a trace cases alive in our collective memory. If you're fascinated by unsolved disappearances, mysterious vanishings, and suspenseful real stories about disappeared persons, consider subscribing. We explore cold cases, missing persons investigations, and unexplained disappearances that deserve to be remembered. Sometimes people disappeared and never found become people vanished and found after years. Hope exists even in the darkest mysteries. Share this missing person story if you believe every vanished person deserves justice. What unsolved missing person cases haunt you most? Leave your thoughts below.